crash was not an accident, it was a desperate invitation. Now, the jungle wants to know what remains of your soul. The plane disintegrated in midair, but it wasn't the sound of metal tearing that froze the blood. It was the greenish light, not lightning, not mechanical failure, but something directed, something unnaturally intelligent that wrapped around the fuselage like an electrified shroud just seconds before the hull buckled. When consciousness returned, it was a searing agony, salt water, fuel, and the silent, dark immensity of the ocean. I was clinging to a jagged piece of the wing, the sole island of stability in a sea of floating death and shattered luggage. Every sluggish wave was a hammer blow against my chest. Around me, the water was stained black with oil and the chilling finality of human failure, reflecting the few indifferent stars of an alien hemisphere. Survival was not a choice. It was a desperate, primal reflex. I swam, guided by a faint, distant silhouette, a dark, colossal promise of temporary reprieve. It took an age to reach the shore, my muscles burning to ash, my vision blurring in ragged desperation. When my legs finally hit the impossible sand, I dragged my broken body onto the heat, collapsing in a painful, ragged heap. 3 ribs were shattered, and a deep, pulsing wound in my leg bled freely onto the beach. The dehydration was a physical weight, pressing the world into a narrow, suffocating tunnel. Just before the black curtain of unconsciousness finally claimed me, I forced my eyes open one last time, needing to know where I had died. At the boundary where the sand met the impenetrable jungle, where the dense alien foliage began, stood a shadow. It was impossibly tall, unnaturally thin and motionless, watching me with a perfect, silent intensity. It was the last thing I saw before the deep, crushing silence took over. It was waiting. The memory of the impossible figure at the tree line remained, a cold, crystalline shard in the heat-induced haze of the following days. Survival became a brutal, rhythmic loop: search, find, rest, and fight the deepening infection in my leg. I managed to use what little plane debris survived, scraps of titanium and shredded synthetic fabric, to build a precarious shelter beneath a cluster of dense, foreign trees. Water, cool and clean, was found in a stream nearby, and I risked eating strange, brightly colored fruits that tasted safe though alien. But the fever was a relentless tide. It would recede only to crash back stronger, dragging me down into shivering delirium, where the jungle seemed to breathe and whisper in a language older than my own species. The pain in my lower leg was a constant, throbbing drumbeat. The wound was angry, swollen, and weeping a dark, foul fluid. It was during one of these delirious dips that I felt the presence again. The air in the tiny shelter dropped several degrees, and the buzzing insects went silent. I forced my heavy eyelids open. Not 5 meters away, standing perfectly motionless and framed by the doorway, was the creature. It was even taller than I remembered, at least 2 meters, impossibly slender. Its skin was thin, stretching over its bones, and had the unsettling quality of constantly shifting color, like accelerated tree bark or liquid camouflage trying to decide its form. Its head, elongated backward, was partially covered by what appeared to be dark, mobile vines or vegetable filaments that swayed without any apparent wind. I couldn't run. My body was a prison of pain. When its immense black eyes focused on me, I felt a sharp, intrusive pressure deep inside my skull, as if something cold and precise was attempting to unlock a forbidden door. Then, without a sound, it simply melted. It didn't move away. It blended so seamlessly with the jungle's backdrop that it vanished before my eyes, leaving behind only the silence and the chill. I spent the next hour shivering, clutching the splintered metal of the fuselage, certain the mental intrusion had left a permanent scar on my psyche. But when morning broke, filtering through the strange foliage, the intense pressure inside my head was gone, replaced by a lingering, almost mentholated scent. I saw the reason immediately. A small pile of leaves, vibrant green and deeply veined, lay precisely at the entrance of my shelter. They were unlike anything I had seen on the island, or indeed on Earth. My desperation, fueled by the relentless fever, overcame my fear. This was not an attack, it was an offering. I crushed the leaves and applied the resulting pungent poultice directly to the leg wound. The initial pain was a shock, a tearing, freezing sensation that made me scream until my throat was raw. But within an hour, the throbbing receded, the swelling visibly diminished, and by noon, the fever had entirely broken. The infection was not merely stopped, it had been annihilated. Where the deepest part of the wound had been, the skin now possessed a subtle, hard resilience, and I could swear the veins around the scar had taken on a faint, luminous green hue. Later that evening, in a moment of profound, wordless gratitude, I left a small pile of the safest-looking fruits outside the shelter, a reciprocation to the unseen doctor. By dawn, the fruits were gone. In their place, resting on the damp earth, was a strange object, a greenish crystalline formation, the size of my fist. It pulsed with its own cold internal light when I touched it, and its surface was carved with symbols that seemed to shift and reform if I stared too long. It radiated an intense, focused warmth that was immediately comforting. I slipped it into the inner pocket of my torn jacket, a second, alien heart beating against my ribcage. The island had given me medicine, now it had given me a focus. The mystery deepened, transforming from pure terror into a compelling, dangerous fascination. I knew then I wouldn't leave the island, not until I understood what this creature was trying to initiate. The core, as I instinctively began to call the crystal, felt warm and alive against my skin. Its presence seemed to sharpen my senses, allowing me to perceive subtle distortions in the jungle floor that I hadn't noticed before. I saw them clearly that afternoon. Footprints, definitely not human. 5 long, slender fingers and the 6th, opposed digit, like an exaggerated thumb, pressed deep into the loam. They suggested an owner who weighed far more than the creature's thin figure implied. Driven by a desperate need for answers, I followed the tracks into a part of the jungle I had scrupulously avoided, a section where the vegetation was wildly different. Here, the flora defied terrestrial biology. Plants pulsed with impossible colors, neon blues, electric violets, and glowing oranges. Biomechanical structures, smooth and metallic-looking, merged seamlessly with the bark of the trees, suggesting a terrifying organic architecture. The footprints led me to a central, perfect clearing. It was startlingly geometric, carved out of the chaotic growth. In the middle stood a low structure that could only be an altar. The core I held immediately pulsed stronger, resonating with a cluster of similar crystals arranged in a precise geometric pattern on the altar's surface. I felt her presence before I saw her, a cold resonance in the core matching the sudden, dense silence of the clearing. I turned slowly. She was 3 meters away, completely motionless, watching me. Her shifting, bark-patterned skin was now illuminated by the combined light of the altar crystals. This time she did not flee. She took one deliberate step toward me. Raising my hand, I showed her the core. She nodded, an infinitesimal movement of her elongated head, and then pointed first to the crystal and then to her own forehead. I understood the silent command, connect. The hesitation was brief, a final futile grasp at my human fear. Then, driven by the magnetic certainty of the moment, I pressed the core against my own brow. The world exploded. It wasn't sound or light, but pure, raw information, colors and sensations rushing into my consciousness like a catastrophic wave. Her name hit me first, unpronounceable by human mouth, a sound like wind rushing through jungle after rain. I decided, in that moment of communion, to call her Echo. The rush of data was overwhelming, yet strangely organized, like being handed the operational manual for a universe I'd never known existed. Echo did not speak in words. Her language was a cascade of images, raw emotions, and abstract concepts that flooded the core. I learned, in the span of a single human breath, that she was not a visitor to this island. She was the island, or rather, the island was a physical manifestation of her sprawling, complex, sentient ecosystem. The vision showed me the island millennia ago, a simple green paradise. Then came the seed, not a ship, but a mass of cosmic spores, an intelligent life form from a dying star system that impacted the planet. It began to fuse instantly with the local flora and fauna, accelerating evolution into an emergent collective consciousness. Echo was born from that union, the single localized point where the stellar intelligence found an anchor in terrestrial form. She showed me her life, centuries of solitary existence, observing the slow geological changes and the rare, terrified human contact. She was a symbiotic consciousness, inextricably bound to every root, every biomechanical structure, and every pulsing crystal in this dense, impossible jungle. She had been observing me since the moment the plane went down, reading my fevered thoughts, understanding my pain. The leaves, the cure, the core, these were all guided gifts, calculated attempts at connection. When I thought the question, "Are you alone?" the response was a devastating wave of loneliness that was so intense it bordered on physical pain. It was a loneliness that permeated the island's very atmosphere, a desperate need for a conscious companion who would not flee in terror or attack what they did not understand. She was unique, alone and fighting a constant battle to maintain her individual self against the sheer, overwhelming tide of the collective island consciousness. The initial sense of awe quickly soured when the images shifted, showing me the moments before the crash, not just through my eyes, but through Echo's perspective. The core resonated with immense guilt, a painful, flooding emotion that overwhelmed the mental connection. I saw the island from high above, an emerald jewel in the vast, dark ocean. I saw the plane, my plane, a tiny silver insect approaching the periphery. The island, she showed me, was surrounded by a subtle, naturally occurring field of greenish energy, a sophisticated, self-maintaining defense system generated by the collective consciousness of the spores. She hadn't consciously willed the plane down, but her profound, consuming loneliness had. She was a single, conscious node in a vast, silent network, and her desperate need for connection had become an emotional amplifier. That raw, untethered emotional signal had boosted the field's natural attractive properties, turning a passive defense into a desperate magnetic invitation. The plane's navigation, already compromised by the strange tropical currents and my own illness, was subtly redirected, drawn inward like metal to a hidden magnet. The final surge of greenish light I remembered was the field attempting to envelop and soften the impact. Not to destroy, but to secure the visitor. The realization was staggering. I wasn't a castaway of fate, but a target of profound isolation. I felt a surge of fury, not at malice, but at the sheer, terrifying scale of her self-centered need. The answer to my silent, furious question was not a justification, but a crippling wave of regret and sorrow. She hadn't meant to. She had simply been too alone, too vast and too powerful to control her own yearning. She then showed me the core on the altar, pulsing in synchrony with its brethren, explaining that the entire system was a two-way device, a barrier, but also a call. It broadcast her silent, desolate invitation into the empty cosmos, hoping to draw something, anything, conscious and receptive. And it had found me. Despite the crushing weight of the revelation that I was here because of a celestial creature's loneliness, I didn't immediately turn away. The connection through the core was addictive, offering a depth of understanding and reality I had never encountered. Echo came daily, teaching me to interpret the flood of sensory data. Her language wasn't just images. It included the feeling of water evaporating from a leaf, the slow grind of plate tectonics, and the hum of the core crystals. But as my mental world expanded, my physical world began to contract. The scar on my leg, healed by the mentholated leaves, was now surrounded by a network of subtle, luminous green veins that spread slowly like intricate, foreign moss. I watched them in the fading light, pulsating faintly beneath my skin, an undeniable mark of the island's influence. What is happening to me? I sent the thought, laced with a new strain of fear. Echo's response was immediate and without apology: symbiosis. She projected an image of the initial leaves. They hadn't just been medicine. They were complex, organic vectors. They introduced the stellar spores into my system, modifying my body at a cellular level, integrating the cosmic intelligence with my human biology. The transformation she conveyed had been initiated the moment I crushed the poultice onto my leg. It was an accelerated evolution, not a disease. When I demanded to know how to stop it, the wave of sadness returned, coupled with a crushing, absolute certainty. The process was too far along. The spores were now an integral part of my immune and circulatory systems. To try and reverse the change now, to chemically attack the new life, would be equivalent to triggering a systemic shutdown. It would kill me. I stared down at my forearm, where the greenish lines were now faintly visible, tracing patterns that vaguely mirrored the symbols on the core. I was becoming something different, something unintended by either my species or hers. A bridge. The horror was palpable. Yet beneath it, a sliver of terrifying fascination took root. I was dying, but I was also being remade. The truth was a sudden, cold shock of water, erasing all the awe and wonder of the cosmic connection. I recoiled, ripping the core from my forehead, breaking the torrent of information. My mind screamed the word imprisonment. Echo made no move to stop me, projecting only a profound sense of regret and renewed loneliness through the still humming crystal in my hand. I turned and ran, stumbling back through the biomechanical jungle, ignoring the impossible colors and the twisting roots that had felt so welcoming moments ago. I ran until the heat of the open sand seared my feet, collapsing far down the beach, as far as possible, from the dense, silent tree line that concealed her. For 2 days, I hid, observing the tide and the distant, empty horizon with the desperate, bitter hope of rescue that I knew would never come. But the silence of the beach was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of observation. The core pulsed beside me, not communicating directly, but broadcasting fragmented emotions, a constant, low-frequency hum of waiting and sadness. More alarmingly, I began to perceive the island in ways that defied human understanding. The wind direction ceased to be a simple meteorological event. I felt its movement as a gentle shifting of my own energy. The distant rustle of animals was no longer just a sound, but a precise mental map of their location and intent. I could feel the profound thirst of the plants during the midday heat, and the quiet, collective sigh of the massive trees in the evenings. The greenish veins continued their spread, now faintly tracing paths up my neck and across my shoulder. I was a radio receiver, tuning into the island's ancient frequency, and with every passing hour, the static of my human identity grew fainter. Echo was still there, a patient, mournful silhouette at the edge of the jungle, waiting for the terror to fade. I realized I was not just running from her. I was running from the inevitable self. The fear began to erode, not through defiance, but through exhaustion and a chilling realization of the alternative. My flight to this remote region hadn't been a vacation. It was a desperate final attempt to treat a progressive autoimmune disease that was already systematically consuming my body. That old life, the doctors, the experimental treatments, the slow, agonizing decline, now seemed infinitely more terrifying than the jungle. At least here, the change was immediate, powerful, and alive. Here, the process was one of aggressive, beautiful integration, not slow dissolution. That night, separated from Echo, I had the most vivid dream of my life. I was not fleeing the jungle. I was part of it. My skin shifted, mimicking the exact texture and shade of the surrounding bark, allowing me to merge seamlessly with the vegetation when I chose to rest. I felt the sap rise in my veins, the sunlight feeding my cells. In the dream, I wasn't a monster. I was free, unbound from the fragile, failing shell of my humanity. I awoke on the sand with a clarity that shocked me. I couldn't go back to the world, not just because the spores would kill me there, but because the man I was before the crash was already dead. The man who remained was something new, and he had a choice: to waste his remaining time hating the inevitable, or to face it and claim the truth. I gripped the core, which vibrated with a gentle, insistent pulse, a steady invitation back into the light. I needed all the answers, not just the mechanism of my change, but the full, brutal history of the stellar spores and their interactions with previous life. I needed to know if any part of my mind, my human self, could survive this transcendence. I stood, ignoring the pain in my newly hardened leg, and turned my back on the empty sea. The island waited, dark and silent, and I walked back into the dense, impossible green. The destination was the altar clearing, and the goal was confrontation. Echo was waiting in the altar clearing, exactly as she had been before, her posture conveying the immense, silent patience of the planet itself. This time, there were no evasions. I did not need to press the core to my forehead to demand the truth. My own presence, my resolute, transformed will, opened the channel immediately. She showed me the complete history, laid bare in my mind as a visual, devastating epic. The spores that fell millennia ago were not an accident, but the final legacy of a civilization dying in a distant star system. They were seeds of cosmic life, scattered across the galaxy by beings who wanted their consciousness to survive their extinction. Most of the seeds failed upon landing on Earth. Some briefly flourished at different points, but were inevitably destroyed by early, terrified humans who perceived the emergent, changing life as a horror or a plague. This island, however, was different, isolated by storm systems and treacherous currents, allowing the spores to flourish undisturbed. They evolved, merging with the local life, creating the unique ecosystem and the collective consciousness that underlies everything. From this consciousness, individuals emerged, beings like Echo, symbiosis personified. She showed me the others, a small community that existed for a time, but they had all made choices. Some chose to fully reintegrate, dissolving their individuality back into the quiet flow of the ecosystem. Others tried to leave the island and died instantly, rejected by the outside world. Echo remained, alone, watching. Then came the occasional shipwrecked humans. She tried the same thing with them: communication, sharing, the attempt at merger. Every single one had failed the process, their human immune systems rejecting the spores in a horrific, fatal agony. Why me? The question burned through the connection. Her answer was startlingly simple and scientific. My autoimmune condition. The experimental treatments I had been receiving had fundamentally altered my immune response, making my system uniquely, miraculously receptive to the stellar spores. I wasn't stronger, I was simply chemically compatible. This time, I would survive the process. The core went quiet, the flood of revelation receding, leaving me standing in the clearing with the monumental weight of cosmic history and my own mortality resting on my shoulders. I was already too altered to leave. The outside world, with its absence of spores and its aggressive environment, would be a death sentence, whether by the transformation's rejection or by the disease that had brought me here. My choice wasn't between life and death, but between a slow, painful surrender to inevitability or a radical embrace of the unknown. I looked at Echo, her bark-like skin shifting from green to copper in the rising dawn light. She had shown me her mistakes, her loneliness, and the fate of those who came before me. The time for fear was over. It was time for self-determination. I projected my decision, clear and resolute. I would accept the final merger, but not without terms. If I was to be a bridge, that bridge would be protected. I sent 3 inviolable conditions through the core, watching for her reaction. First, the energy barrier, the desperate call that had pulled my plane down, must be permanently deactivated. No more accidental invitations, no more death by loneliness. Second, she must never again initiate the symbiotic process with any other future castaway. If others arrive by natural catastrophe, they must be given aid, but allowed the freedom to choose their own destiny, even if it is to build a raft and sail towards certain death. And third, my individuality, my human mind and spirit must be respected and preserved throughout the merger. Echo stood motionless for a long moment, the vines on her head swaying slightly, processing the demands. Then, a pulse of profound respect and agreement resonated through the core. She accepted the pact. I took a deep breath of the spore-rich air and walked toward the altar, ready for the final, terrifying communion. I lay down on the cold, crystal-encrusted altar, the stone surprisingly smooth and warm beneath my spine. Echo stepped closer. Her shifting skin now settled into a deep, vibrant emerald, reflecting the finality of the choice. The core crystal, which I still held, began to vibrate wildly, and the crystals on the altar rose slowly, surrounding us both, floating in the air like a crown of cold, pulsing stars. As the light intensified, I projected my last human thought, a simple, fearful acceptance, and Echo placed her impossibly slender hands on my chest, directly over my heart. The resulting pain was immediate and absolute. It wasn't the pain of injury, but the agonizing cellular agony of reconstruction, as if every molecule in my body was being ripped apart and instantaneously reformed to accommodate the new stellar life. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the resonance of the crystals. The entire clearing shook. The massive jungle trees swayed violently without wind, and birds fled the canopy in a panic. Then, just as the pain reached a point beyond endurance, it shattered into a million points of light and silence. I inhaled, and the atmosphere felt like pure, unadulterated energy. I opened my eyes, no longer seeing the clearing, but feeling it. I was no longer an observer. I was a node in the network. The core in my hand was just an extension of my own mind. My skin now effortlessly shifted tone and texture, adapting to the light and shadow. I was symbiont human in consciousness, but connected in body. Echo was standing over me, her energy intertwined with mine, and in the profound, expanded silence of the connection, we felt it, a new pulse, deep beneath the bedrock of the mountain. It was slower, ancient, and undeniably conscious. The collective consciousness was stirring. The sleepers, the other symbionts who had long ago chosen to reintegrate, were beginning to stir in their long hibernation, awakened by the unexpected harmony and power of our balanced union. We were no longer two lone individuals. The community was beginning to awaken. The island breathes, and I breathe with it. We wait for the sleepers, now part of the deep, boundless symphony.